Unspeakable, The Tulsa Race Massacre by Carole Boston Weatherford. Illustrations by Floyd Cooper. Once upon a time, near Tulsa, Oklahoma, prospectors struck it rich in the oil fields. The wealth created jobs raising buildings and attracted newcomers from far and wide, seeking fortune and a fresh start. Once upon a time in Tulsa, there was a community called Greenwood. Its residents descended from black Indians, from formerly enslaved people, and from exodusters, who moved west in the late 1800s, fleeing the violence and racism of the segregated South. Once upon a time in Greenwood, there were some 10,000 people living in a 35 square block area. Train tracks divided the black and white communities. Segregation laws called for separate neighborhoods, schools, phone booths, and railroad and streetcar coaches. Unfair tests made it hard for blacks to register to vote, and laws barred marriages across racial lines. So many black businesses cropped up along a 1-mile stretch of Greenwood Avenue that educator and business leader Booker T. Washington called the area the Negro Wall Street of America. The name later became Black Wall Street, and the community kept thriving. Once upon a time on Black Wall Street, there were dozens of restaurants and grocery stores. There were furriers, a pool hall, a bus system, and an auto shop, nearly 200 businesses in all. There were also several libraries, a hospital, a post office, and a separate school system, where some say black children got a better education than whites. There were 2 black-owned newspapers, the Tulsa Star and the Oklahoma Sun, and over 20 churches, and 15 black doctors, including Dr. A.C. Jackson, the most able black surgeon in the nation. On Detroit Avenue stood grand homes of doctors, lawyers, and prominent businessmen. Once upon a time in Greenwood, there were barber shops and beauty salons. Miss Mabel's Little Rose Beauty Salon boomed on Thursdays when maids who worked for white families got coiffed on their day off and strutted in style up and down Greenwood Avenue. The soda fountain at Williams Confectionery was the backdrop for scores of marriage proposals. And there was the luxurious Stratford Hotel, then the largest black-owned hotel in the nation. Black guests were welcome there, even as they were barred from Tulsa's white hotels. Once upon a time in Greenwood, there were 2 movie theaters, including the 800-seat black-owned Dreamland. There were even 6 privately owned airplanes. But in 1921, not everyone in Tulsa was pleased with the signs of black wealth, undeniable proof that African Americans could achieve just as much, if not more than whites. All it took was one elevator ride, one 17-year-old white elevator operator accusing a 19-year-old black shoeshine man of assault for simmering hatred to boil over. With the accused man in jail, the white-owned Tulsa Tribune newspaper ran a headline prompting readers to nab him. Fearing the man would be lynched, killed by a mob before his trial, 30 armed black men rushed downtown to his rescue. At the jail, they faced off with 2,000 armed whites. On May 31, 1921, one day after Memorial Day, a holiday honoring fallen soldiers, skirmishes between the 2 groups left 2 black men and 10 white men dead. But the worst was yet to come. Unable to get to the jailed suspect, the white mob sparked rumors that the black community planned to attack. Unchecked and in some cases deputized by the police, the white mob stormed into Greenwood, looting and burning homes and businesses that blacks had saved and sacrificed to build. Threatening to shoot, the mob blocked firefighters from putting out the blazes. African American World War I veterans took up arms to defend their families and property, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Families fled with only what they could carry. Once upon a time in Greenwood, up to 300 black people, including Dr. Jackson, were killed. Hundreds more were injured. More than 8,000 people were left homeless, and hundreds of businesses and other establishments were reduced to ash. The police did nothing to protect the black community. When the National Guard arrived the next day, all that was left to do was put out fires and moved thousands of black residents into camps outside of Tulsa. As their community lay in ruins, black residents had to carry passes to enter the city. In the days and weeks that followed, some black Tulsans left and never returned. Others stayed and rebuilt the Greenwood community, only to witness its decline in the 1960s. For decades, survivors did not speak of the terror. 75 years passed before lawmakers launched an investigation to uncover the painful truth about the worst racial attack in the United States history. Police and city officials had plotted with the white mob to destroy the nation's wealthiest black community. Today, Tulsa's Reconciliation Park remembers victims of the 1921 massacre and recalls the role of African Americans in Oklahoma history. But the park is not just a bronze monument to the past. It is a place to realize the responsibility we all have to reject hatred and violence and to instead choose hope. For me, racist backlash hits close to home. One cousin in Tennessee burned to death in his home, a rumored lynching. In the 1920s, whites allegedly burned down a store that belonged to another of my cousins in an all-black village, confounded by my great-great-grandfather during Reconstruction. In my adopted state of North Carolina, another Black Wall Street anchored Durham, once a hub of black enterprise, and another race massacre occurred in Wilmington in 1898. Thus, family lore and proximity to history led me to the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. Tulsa's history stretches back to 1836 when Muskogee Creek Indians, who had been forced to leave Alabama, settled there. The name Tulsa comes from the Creek word Tallahassee or Tulhasi, meaning old town. At the time, what is now Oklahoma was part of an area known as Indian Territory, and other tribes in the southeast were also forced to relocate there. In the decades that followed, increasing numbers of blacks and whites moved to the area, and Oklahoma became a U.S. state in 1907. During the early 20th century, Tulsa transformed into a booming oil town, and many African Americans viewed it as a promised land. Tulsa's thriving African American Main Street of Greenwood Avenue was even dubbed Black Wall Street. Yet many white Tulsans resented the success of the black community. Nationwide racial tensions increased when World War I ended in 1918. African American soldiers who had fought and shed blood for their country hoped to receive greater respect back at home, but they did not. Violence against African Americans broke out in numerous cities and states in the summer of 1919, which became known as the Red Summer. Regardless of the supposed cause, the white mob's motives were always to limit black political and economic progress and to reassert white supremacy. Then on May 30th, 1921, in Tulsa, Dick Rowland, an African American teen, either stumbled or stepped on the foot of Sarah Page, a young white elevator operator in a downtown office building. Page screamed, and the next day, Rowland was jailed. A newspaper report that Rowland assaulted Page stoked existing racial tensions, inciting a white mob initially numbering in the hundreds, but was bent on lynching the teen. Black men and boys were frequent victims of white lynch mobs that publicly murdered them, often by hanging, for alleged offenses. A smaller number of black residents came to the courthouse where Rowland was being held in an effort to protect him. When the sheriff refused to surrender Rowland, the white mob, which had been increasing in number, turned violent. After a night of scattered attacks, at dawn the mob invaded the black community, burning down at least 1,250 homes and 200 businesses, and robbing and looting hundreds more. The 16-hour massacre claimed countless lives. Among the dead was an African-American boy shot in a movie theater. Many victims were buried in unmarked graves. Even before the smoke had cleared, the police dropped the charges against Dick Rowland, and he was released from jail. He left town the very next day, reportedly for good. Exact numbers of fatalities, casualties, and participants are unknown because public officials at the time focused on covering up the massacre rather than documenting it. Not until the 21st century was this tragic chapter of history even taught in Oklahoma schools. In 1997, the state of Oklahoma authorized an investigation into the so-called race riot. The Oklahoma Commission to study the Tulsa Race Riot of 1921 concluded that the violence left from 150 to 300 people dead and more than 8,000 people homeless. In the wake of the massacre, Greenwood was rapidly rebuilt, yet the burial sites of most of the massacre's black victims have never been found. However, archaeologists located human remains in an unmarked mass grave at a Tulsa cemetery in October 2020, and their investigations continue. In Greenwood today, you'll find John Hope Franklin Reconciliation Park. It includes a Tower of Reconciliation as well as 3 bronze sculptures based on photographs from the massacre representing hostility, humiliation, and hope. A world-class history center is currently being built, and other improvements to the Greenwood district are ongoing. Illustrator's note: the creation of this book started in 2018, but my connection to the story goes back to my childhood in Tulsa and visits to my grandpa in Muskogee. My grandpa loved to talk. When family came to visit, he talked. When a neighbor dropped by, right there on the front steps, he'd go on for hours about history, current events, news, and politics. We kids thought this was so boring. But we hung around because we loved to hear Grandpa's voice, and every now and then we'd learn a few things. In those days, not many people talked about what had happened back in 1921. But one night, Grandpa talked about Greenwood with us. He had grown up there, and he told us how he was home the night when folks from south of the Frisco tracks came to Greenwood. He said everyone was caught off guard, like sitting ducks, when the looting, shooting, and fires burned Greenwood Avenue, the famous Black Wall Street, to the ground. Everything I knew about this tragedy came from Grandpa. Not a single teacher at school ever spoke of it. For a long time, we knew it was the Tulsa Race Riot, but some people have said the word riot was just a way to further injure the black community. Insurance companies didn't have to pay for damage to homes and businesses caused by a riot. So this meant black folks had to find other ways to pay to rebuild what they'd lost. More recently, people have started calling it the Tulsa Race Massacre. A massacre is the violent killing of a number of usually helpless or unresisting people. By any name, it's an event that's deeply personal for me. Now, the same way my grandpa told the story to us, I share it here with you. My grandpa passed away many years ago, but I hope that my art and Carole Boston Weatherford's words can speak for Grandpa.